So here I have my line drawing as I finished for a previous video. The very first thing I'm going to do is to apply some tape. The second thing to do is to plan out my use of tone. The first thing is to refer back to my reference photo. I can tweak it to improve the look of my drawing as much as I want. Usually, I work out my tone from my color reference. And I like to print off a color reference because it helps me distinguish the various parts of the scene more easily if they're in color, because it distinguishes things better for me. However, sometimes I'll print off a black and white copy and I allow the digital transformation this gives me to help me see how the local colors translate into black and white. A really helpful tip is to tweak the contrast up so that the lights become lighter and the darks become darker, which can help us just work out, is this tone different to this tone? And so I've done that slightly with this. And the next really important thing to do is to get my color chart. If you haven't seen the video where I make this, then go back and have a look at it. But what this helps me do is to work out the best tones to get the various shades I want. Usually the most important things are to work out the darkest and the lightest shades. Lighter shades are going to be white, because what I want to show most clearly is the full sunlight on these buildings. Then I'm going to have these facades that face the sun white. These side walls have tone on them because they're in shade and shadow. And this section here of this column, which is in sunlight, I'll leave as the white of the paper. The other question is this footpath here and this roadway. Am I going to leave them white, or am I going to put some color on them? Now, they're not very dark, but there is a local color which is about the same tone as the fronts of the buildings, only it's a grey rather than this sandy, light sandy brown. But I think I want to increase the effect of light on these facades. And so to help me do this, I'm going to put some light tone on the road and on the pathway. So having plotted in my head, now it's helpful to start to consider a few of the actual sketch marker choices. In this drawing, I'm using my Copic sketch markers. They have a brush end and a chisel end. I only ever use the brush end because the brush end works so nicely. What is my darkest area here, and how dark do I want to go? In terms of broad areas of tone, this roofing area that's in shade is the darkest area. And I think I'm going to use a 5 for that. It's not a large area, I can always make it darker. And I'm going to use a 5 here as well because it's a similar shade. For the front, I'm going to use a 3 because I want this to be clearly lighter than that. Besides that, I've got some dark shadows under overhanging balconies and cornices. I'll at least start with a 4 with those. I've also got these lampposts. I've got some fairly dark shadows in these windows and in some of the others. I might do 4 or 5 in those. I've got the clothing of my pedestrians, and I will definitely do some quite very dark tones in those because that will bring them forward. Darker tones come forward, and I'm going to start with these dark areas. So I get my Copic N5 neutral grey, and my intention is that I will actually use all of the tones from N0 through to N5, and I may end up using N6. When we apply tone, I think it's always helpful to use our direction to reinforce the surface shape of the object that we're applying tone to. Now I need to preserve a thin white strip here. The other thing we can use our tone for is to correct mistakes. Now I've not been happy with this line. I felt that it didn't angle up enough. So I've taken advantage of using the marker to just slightly increase the angle so that as a perspective line, it sits better. And so now I'm going to do this mansard wall in the same shade. I don't systematically work through the whole drawing with the one pen. I do section by section. I do want to now put the local color on the other side of this mansard window. And I'm going to use the 3 also for what we can see of the mansard roof. And I think I'll certainly try a 3 for this chimney here. The thing about tone, it's not so much how dark is it, but how dark is this tone in relation to the tones around it. So I want to capture the fact there's 2 different tones on this wall, and there's also deeper shadows. Because there's more light bouncing around, it looks slightly lighter here than further in. I'm going to try and show that by simply doing a few more coats of my tone here. I'm going to use N2 and N1. I'll apply the N1, the lighter tone, first to this section. And now I'll apply the N2 to the adjacent section. All of this facade is in the sunlight. So it's really just picking out these parts where the bright light is casting a shadow. Now shadow is darker, so I'll be using some darker tones. And I'm looking at this and I think I'm going to use 4 for these tones. And then I may add a little bit of 5 if I think it needs it. I'm going to switch to a 3 now. I'm going to try these lamps. I'll try them in N5. My thought was I would use a 0 here for the footpath and for the parts behind, and a 1 across the roadway. A line here underneath just as a shadow line for the fence in N1. And looking at this now, I think we're getting a nicer sun effect if I now leave this roadway white. It sits forward now from the footpath behind, and I think it gives a nicer play with light on the building. So I'm changing my mind about this, and we're going to leave this white. The next thing we do will be to establish the tones on these columns. They are a relatively dark area. I'm thinking N3 for this column. For the darker shadows, I'll go to N4. I'm going to keep this darkest N5 away from here because I don't want to draw the eye too much to here. But the shadow here will help make the light look brighter on the buildings. It's all about juggling the relative values that we use in our tone work rather than what actual tone we used. I'll do this whole column in a 3 first. And I'll do a 3 down here, get some tone on it for now. So now I'm using N4. I think I'm going to try with N1. I was going to use N2, but that's looking a bit too stark. I will get my 2. I'm going to do this tree now since it's right here, and I've decided to go with N5. No, actually I'll start with N4 and just see if that's dark enough. In fact, N4 was just all I needed. So now we'll work on this facade here, and there are some quite dark shadows under the overhangs, and I'm going to use N4 for those. I think that's enough. It is a much lighter touch because it's further away. Part of using our tone work to show distance and to create a sense of depth is to use a lighter touch, not just with the line, but also with the tone the further away we go. So now I have these buildings here in the distance. I want to use them to create a nice contrast between this building in sun and these darker tones here. But I need to allow for the fact that they are further away as well. So I'm going to use N3 as my darkest tone. Now I'm going to go a bit darker. I'm going to use a 4. People's clothing allows us to have some very dark darks. I'll use a 4 for these jeans that are a bit further away. And I'm going to leave all of their tops white. I wouldn't normally do that, but it's so busy already with the railing. So there we have it, and we used from 0 to 5 in this scene, and we made some changes on the way. I'm really happy with the way it's all working, except perhaps for these columns, they look a bit stark. I think I may add some line work to them, reflect the fluting that is carved into them. But there it is, tone applied to my Paris street scene. And the final task, of course, is to very carefully remove our tape. Hi, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope that was interesting and helpful. Applying tone can really transform our drawings, and it can be a lot of fun to use too when it works well. If I can summarize what I was stepping through in that video, it would be to be cautious at first in using tones. Where possible, use a lighter tone if you're not sure, because you can always come over the top with a darker tone, or even possibly with a second or third coat of that same tone. But there's no going back once you've put a dark tone onto the paper. The important thing is to have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.